Let us discuss the case study, water supply model for outer islands of the Maldives. Look at the map of the Maldives shown on top left corner of this slide. Maldives consist of hundreds of small inhabited islands that are distributed over a vast ocean area in the Indian Ocean. Next, look at the maps of the three islands on the right. Most of the outer islands in the country are super small, but they are also densely populated. This graph shows the distribution of population over outer islands of the Maldives. For clarity, only some of the islands are labeled. For comparison, we have also shown the population density in the capital, Male, as well as some selected countries in the world. There are more than 100 inhabited islands with less than 1,000 population. But at the same time, the population densities of these islands are pretty high, even compared with most densely populated urban areas in the world. So this combination of small size, small population, but very high population densities pose significant challenges for water supply as well as for other infrastructure services. Let's look at the history of water supply in the Maldives. Over hundreds of years, people were relying on the groundwater for their water supply needs. These coral atoll islands have a freshwater lens, that is a layer of fresh water that is continuously replenished by rainfall, that is floating above the brackish and salty water. The thickness of this freshwater layer is often small, like several meters, and it is dynamic and very sensitive to both the rainfall and surface conditions, as it critically depends on the continuous recharge by infiltration. Using rainwater as a source is probably an old practice as well. But in late 70s, already due to the increase of population and urbanization, the groundwater quality and quantity was not adequate to supply the needs of the people. So rainwater harvesting at household level using large storage tanks was introduced around 1978 and has been practiced in these islands ever since. 1995 saw the first introduction of desalination plants in the capital Male, and recently this has been the trend in many of the outer islands as well. Probably due to the high human activities due to the very high population densities, the groundwater system in these islands are polluted. The foul smell observed in the groundwater system is probably due to this pollution. In 2020, Jalil and the co-authors published a groundwater quality perception survey covering 45 inhabited islands in the Maldives. This research shows some 93% of the households that were interviewed indicated that their groundwater has a foul smell. Some of the recent water quality studies we have done also confirm the fact that the groundwater system is indeed polluted, possibly due to sewage. The current situation of the water supply. First, let's understand the drivers. The climate has a long rainy period and a dry period that lasts from December to about April. During this dry period, often the outer islands used to run out of harvested rainwater. So the government had to provide so-called emergency water supplies from the capital Male at a great cost. The pollution of the groundwater system has made it next to impossible for people to use groundwater as a potable water source. At the time of this recording, in year 2024, there are some islands with large-scale community-based rainwater harvesting systems that do not provide household-level water supply, but provide a centralized water source from which people can obtain water from. This is largely seen both by the communities and the government now only as a stopgap measure. The real solution that the government and the policymakers are promoting is a hybrid design of desalinated and centrally harvested rainwater mists. In the Maldives, these are called IWRM systems. The original idea was to use three sources of water: desalinated water, the harvested rainwater, and groundwater. That was probably why these systems were termed Integrated Water Resource Management or IWRM systems. But later, the use of groundwater was abandoned due to different reasons, including the pollution and the difficulty of ensuring the sustainability of the groundwater pumping. Let us look at a schematic of the typical water supply of these islands. The salt water is pumped out of groundwater wells more than 20 meters deep, well below the freshwater level. While salinity is the same as the ocean, there is some level of quality control because the groundwater is filtered through soil layers. This salt water is then pre-filtered and subject to a membrane filtration process to desalinate the water. This is by far the most energy intensive process, as it needs pumping at a very high pressure through membranes. Desalination separates most of the fresh water from the salt water. The resulting highly concentrated salty water called brine, and that concentrated brine is discharged into the sea. This brine, which is denser than seawater, has to be discharged to a location with enough turbulence to avoid settling at the surface, harming the aquatic environments. Rainwater is harvested from selected public buildings like schools, places of worship, and government offices. This water is collected into raw water storage tanks and is subjected to ultrafiltration, which brings it up to a quality comparable with the desalinated water. These two water sources are then mixed ideally at about 70 to 30 ratio. This dual source design is expected to achieve two goals. First, it reduces the pumping cost of membrane filtration, reducing the carbon dioxide footprint. Secondly, as rainwater has very little mineral content, it also reduces the hardness of the desalinated water somewhat. At this point, chlorination happens, and the chlorinated water is stored in treated water storage. And then they use inline pumping to bring the water under pressure to the distribution network, which distributes it to the metered connections at households and other places. Solar PV panels are used in many of these systems for partially offsetting the high energy requirement for membrane filtration. Here's a picture of a recently completed water supply schemes. On the left, we have the membrane filtration system. On the right is one of the several water storage units. Recently, we conducted water quality investigations into different water sources in some of the islands with piped water supply. We observed that piped water system in these islands has contamination. This was a remarkable fact, as the residual chlorine should address any later contamination. When we looked into the details of this, we realized that sometimes the required chemicals like chlorine supplies do not reach water treatment plants in time. So The operators are forced to run the system under suboptimal conditions. On top of that, certain construction and maintenance issues have caused the groundwater and other contaminated water sources to leach into the water supply system even after chlorination. Let's look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats related to these systems. This being world-class high-tech systems is a strength. Systems are pretty advanced. Also, partial solar integration reduces both the energy cost and the carbon footprint of this system. A main weakness is also the high-tech advanced nature of these systems, because most of our experience shows that the island communities, the island councils, and the local utilities are struggling to operate and maintain these systems. Considering the size of the population of islands, it is hard to have more than one operator to run this entire system. So efforts are often limited to doing the bare minimum to keep the system running. Most of the routine maintenance tasks are not done. And we also have noticed that the systems are technically very involved, and operators and people who are engaged in these systems are not always trained to run these systems well. All the systems have laboratories with state-of-the-art water quality testing equipment, but these are not used as there are no trained technicians to run the equipment. The water supply is quite expensive to customers. Many islanders showed us their water bills and told us if they use desalinated water supply for all their household needs, it's going to be unbearably expensive. Opportunities. The systems are overbuilt, so they can handle quite a large increase in demand. Of course, at the present moment, it can be seen also as a weakness, but over time, if they last, they could address more demands of water like local tourism or high-tech agriculture. Let us look at the threats to these systems. One of the foremost threats is there is no clear business model even for covering the operation and maintenance cost of these systems. These are mostly running at a financial loss because the income is significantly less than the running cost of the systems. The maintenance and renewal of these are expensive, and there is no clear budgetary allocation for that from the central government or the islands. Another interesting point is people don't like to use these systems as much for potable water needs. One of the complaints they have is that the desalinated water does not taste good. This is probably because Maldivians have been drinking rainwater for decades. Many resort to buying bottled water in single-use plastic bottles, which is financially an immense burden and a great pollution hazard. The government's vision of providing a quality water supply to all the inhabitants of outer islands is admirable. However, looking at the current water supply model, we recognize many threats to the sustainability of those systems. We can ask the question whether these systems are already in decline, even though they are pretty new. My recent discussion with one of the stakeholders related to uh, one of these systems illustrate this point from the viewpoint of stakeholders. Previously, we discussed two components of the system, desalinated water and harvested rainwater. This dialogue is about that. Are you currently using rainwater? I asked. The answer, no, we don't. But the water supply system is very old, you know. Then I asked when it was built. The answer was 2017. So the system is around 7 years old. This dialogue indicates the interesting dynamic of implementing the government's vision. Stakeholders look at the system as a short-term solution. Many of our discussions with different local stakeholders confirmed this. The uh, stakeholders, including beneficiaries, have come to the view that after about 10 years, they will get a new system. In this context, regular maintenance and renewal have no place. No is the life cycle based assessment of costs and benefits. This is a problem, a vicious cycle that we need to address and break. We sometimes name this common issue that we observe in many contexts the build, neglect, rebuild or BNR cycle. Another illustrative personal experience we had when we were working in one of the islands. The power supply system of the island failed. Each island's power supply is provided by a diesel generator set. In this case, it simply stopped working. Soon realized that due to lack of maintenance, there was a cascading failure within the system. So ultimately, it took more than 2 days for the power supply to come back. But immediately within minutes of power failure, we observed that the water supply system has stopped. Due to the use of inline pumping as opposed to water towers which can feed the water under gravity, the water supply system stops functioning if the power supply is out. Let us look at the societal aspects of these systems. Inhabitants of outer islands have been used to drinking rainwater whose hardness is very low. The water supply is much harder than rainwater. Many people don't like to drink it. Those who can afford bottled water spend hundreds of dollars per month per household buying bottled water. This also creates a big plastic pollution problem as the islands lack good solid waste management systems. Others continue drinking locally harvested rainwater. Many people distrust the quality of the supply water. As a stopgap measure, NGOs in some outer islands have started promoting end-of-the-tap filters as a solution. The water supply coming into the house is subjected to another level of membrane filtration so that you get much softer drinkable water and probably some level of assurance of safety. As this picture on the right shows, many of the houses in the outer islands have very complex plumbing systems. The reason for this is that people use three sources of water. They use treated supply water that is coming from the water supply system. Alongside that, they also use groundwater for many of the bulk use needs like flushing toilets and showering. Many use harvested rainwater for drinking. This complex plumbing system also creates a big vulnerability because untrained plumbers often accidentally cross-connect systems, causing cross-contamination. By presenting this case study, we want to raise some questions. Are these of the right level of complexity for this purpose? While supplying household water is a great objective, is it financially feasible in this context? Can islands afford the technical capacity needed to run these systems? Are there better models for water supply for this context? What about the aspirations of the islanders? Have the systems met those aspirations? Are there better ways of doing so? What is wrong with the groundwater causing smell and contamination? Can the groundwater system be made sustainable? Maldives received about 2000 millimeters of annual rainfall on average. Seems like more than enough water for consumption. Can we store it, thus reducing or eliminating the need for desalination water? Most importantly, we want you to think of ways how to extrapolate these lessons into other small island developing states and other similar contexts like small communities. Thank you.